Hello everyone, this is Christine Casey at the Haagen-Dazs Honeybee Haven on the UC Davis campus in Davis, California. This presentation will be a brief introduction to common bees that you see in Central California gardens. Helping me today is Andrea Suarez, our student intern at the Haven. For those of you who don't know us, the Haven has been around for 10 years and, as the name suggests, was a result of a gift from Haagen-Dazs. We provide information and inspiration for gardeners, undergraduate classes and student internships, and do a lot of youth group outreach as well. We also do research to look at the relationship between garden plants and bees. We don't have a dedicated source of funding, so I'd like to right up front acknowledge the many organizations who've provided us with support over the years. Most importantly are the garden volunteers. Without them, it wouldn't be the wonderful place it is. So let's get started with an overview of bees. They're tremendously diverse animals with about 20,000 or so species worldwide. In terms of classification, bees fall into the animal kingdom. They're in the phylum Arthropoda, which is all of the animals that have external skeletons, and in the class Insecta, because they are insects. Within the insect class, they fall into the order Hymenoptera, which means membrane wings, and refers to their clear wings. We'll be looking today at different families, genera, and species. California has a diverse bee fauna with about 40% of all of the North American species. And unlike the honeybee, most bees are solitary. The way that honeybees live with a queen, thousands of workers close together in a hive, this is not typical of most bees. About 70% of them nest underground, and the other 30% are above ground in what we call cavities. The solitary bees don't have a queen. They're simply a male and a female. They mate. She lays her eggs. She provisions that nest either below or above ground. And by the time the eggs have hatched the following year, the adults have died. Even within a small garden like the Haven, we're half-acre in size with 200 or so different plants, we see tremendous diversity of bees. This picture shows you an example of that. On the left is the valley carpenter bee, the largest bee in North America, and quite common in the Haven. And on the right is a small sweat bee. I think it's pretty obvious looking at these that they're going to need very different flowers in terms of shape and size. Before we go on to talk about some of the common bees in gardens, we need to step back and take a look at how we determine if an insect is actually a bee, as opposed to something that looks very similar. So remember, all insects have 3 body segments, a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, and 3 pairs of legs. So if there's 3 body parts and 6 legs, it's an insect. Within the insects, bees are specialized for pollen transport. Bees are vegans. They rely on pollen and nectar as their food sources. So they've evolved special structures for carrying pollen because they need to harvest and quickly move large quantities between the flowers and their nest. Most bees carry pollen on the leg, some have it on the abdomen, and some carry it internally. Here's a picture of a honeybee on the left showing those 3 segments, the head, the thorax, and abdomen, along with a ball of pollen on her leg. An insect commonly confused with bees are flies. And in the garden, just looking at insects that are in flight and moving around, a couple of things will allow you to distinguish between flies and bees. So flies have very short antennae, and you can notice this pretty readily looking at the 2 side by side. Flies also have very large eyes that take up most of the head, and you can see this in the hoverfly pictured in the center here. If we were in a garden and looking at these animals live, you would also see some behavior differences in the way they fly. Hoverflies, as the name suggests, hover over plants, darting back and forth, whereas bees tend to fly in straight lines between plants. You won't see them hovering over a plant, with a couple of exceptions. Another example of a fly that's easily confused with a bee is the bee fly, very appropriately named. But again, looking carefully, you can see those short antennae and the large eyes. And again, if you were to see this fly in person or live in a garden, you would notice again that it's hovering at a flower. It's not darting back and forth like a bee would. Another difference between flies and other insects is that flies only have one pair of wings, whereas other insects have two pairs. This is useful in the lab when we're looking at preserved specimens, but isn't really all that helpful as a distinguishing feature when we're trying to evaluate or identify insects live in the garden. The other insect or group that bees are commonly confused with are wasps. Bees evolved from wasps. Wasps are meat eaters, so they eat other insects. And at some point in evolutionary history, bees started consuming plant pollen as its protein source rather than other insects, and that is what gave rise to bees. So while wasps will consume pollen and nectar, it's not the primary food source. And so what that means is that they have very little hair on their body because the hair that is on bees' body is very effective at catching pollen as they move in and out of flowers, and they can then groom themselves and pack all that pollen into their transport structures. Wasps have no need for that, so you'll see a very smooth body. In addition, wasps have a very obvious waist. The first segment of the abdomen is greatly constricted, which gives this waist-like appearance. So those are two ways you can tell wasps from bees. Now, as I mentioned, most bees are solitary, unlike honeybees, which are social. The way you distinguish this, there's two features. Social insects have a division of labor within the organization, and they provide care of the young. And so within a honeybee hive, different worker bees will have different jobs depending on how old they are, starting with jobs inside the hive, and then the oldest bees leave the hive and are the foragers. There's also care of the young. If you look at the photograph of the beehive on the left here, you see some small white worms on the upper left. Those are immature bees, and those are getting fed by nurse bees. So there's that care of the young going on within a beehive that doesn't happen within the nests of solitary bees. Remember, most of the solitary bees are nesting underground. The nest entrances are very easy to miss. The photograph on the center right shows two nest entrances. They're simply small holes in the ground about the size of a pencil. And within those nests, only the females are entering, which means that the males during the day can fly around and look for females, but at night they have nowhere to go. So you'll find them in sleeping aggregations on plant stems in the area where there are nests of nests made by the female. And so if you see these clusters of bees on plants, that's an indication that you've got nesting going on somewhere in the area. And that's, as I said, 70% of the bees of the solitary bees are nesting underground, and then the other 30% or so of the solitary bees are nesting above ground. In the wild, they use abandoned beetle galleries or other cavities or crevices underneath tree bark. We can create that habitat in the garden with nesting blocks. As you see on the lower part of the right-hand photo there, you can see a bee emerging from one of those nesting blocks. Some other features that are useful in making identifications. Only the females are transporting pollen. The females are the ones within the solitary bees that do all the nest building, and they are the ones transporting pollen back to the nest. So if you see pollen on a bee, you know that it's a female. You'll also, in the case, and this is a good example right here, in the case of these leafcutter bees, you'll notice comparing the male and the female of the Megachile fidelis, the abdomen of the female is much more robust because it is filled with eggs. So that's another clue that is a female rather than the male. And of course, in this case, she is carrying pollen. And the leafcutters are one of the bees that carry pollen on the underside of the abdomen rather than on the leg. Bees also often will have different appearances between male and female. The most extreme example of this is in the valley carpenter bee, which is a native bee here in the Central Valley. The males are a deep golden brown color with green eyes, and the females are solid black. These are the largest bees in California and also, of course, in the Haven at about 1 inch in length. Those of you who are familiar with this bee may know it as Xylocopa varipuncta. Recent DNA analysis has shown that Xylocopa sonorina is actually the same species, and since sonorina was named first, that is the name that these bees will have going forward. Another feature that's useful in identification of not just bees, but many insects is the antennae. And males in bees have one more segment in their antenna than females do, which means that they are longer. And you can see this in this comparison here of a male Sebastra obliqua with a female. You can see how much longer his antennae are. Another clue to help you determine, of course, not only if it's a bee, what species it might be, is how the pollen is being carried. Some bees have what we call a scopa. This is simply a series of long hairs that the pollen adheres to when they pack it in there, and the pollen in the scopa is dry. And you can see that in the photo on the left of the Sebastra obliqua, and then in the center, that leafcutter bee we looked at a moment ago, where the pollen is carried in a scopa on the abdomen. And then other bees have what we call a corbicula, and these are, not surprisingly, called corbiculate bees. The pollen in these bees is carried moist. They mix it with nectar and pack it into a structure called a corbicula that's on the legs. And you can see in this photograph of the Van Dyke's bumblebee how that corbicula is almost like a little bowl that's part of the leg structure. And so a useful tip for these bees is that they will need to have a nectar source near their pollen source because they need to mix the two. So that's something to think about in garden design. So let's move on and look at some of the common bees that you'll encounter in urban gardens. Looking first at the family Apidae. This is one of the largest of the families within bees, and they are very common in urban gardens, and probably the most common is the honeybee. Honeybees are common because many people keep bees, and there are also feral honeybees that have escaped from hives and are living in tree cavities and other areas within urban gardens. So you will see these year-round in Central California because it is mild enough here for year-round activity. Most honeybees are sort of a golden brown color like you see in these photographs, but there are different strains of honeybees. So there are some that are almost solid brown and some that are almost golden, completely golden yellow. They're all honeybees. They're all Apis mellifera. Probably the next most common in this area, certainly in Central California, are the carpenter bees. Both the valley carpenter bee that I mentioned a moment ago, and again you see the male on the left and the female on the right, as well as the mountain carpenter bee, which is pictured in the center. And she's about 3/4 of the size of the valley carpenter bee. And there's a couple of behaviors that these bees do that are very helpful in confirming that that is indeed what you're looking at. In that center photograph of the mountain carpenter bee, you'll notice she's inserting her mouth parts into the base of the flower. They have learned that they can cut a slit in the base of the flower to access the nectar. This is a bee that's too large to enter the flower and access the nectar the normal route. And we call this nectar robbing because the plant has evolved to make that nectar reward to receive the pollination service when the bee goes into the flower. And so when the bee steals the nectar without doing pollination, we call it robbing. Another behavior that you'll notice in the male carpenter bees is that they guard a territory. And you will see them flying between vertical objects in the garden, marking that as their area. And if you're working in your garden, they may very well encompass you or incorporate you into that territory. And it can be great fun actually to watch them fly up quite close to you as they check you out as part of their territory. And only female bees can sting, so there's no need to be concerned about danger from males coming that close to you. And indeed you can see in the photograph of the male on the left, I am touching him. And this is a great way to help introduce kids to bees by catching male bees and allowing them to touch them. They can do this quite safely. Also in the family Apidae are bumblebees, and you will see these possibly quite commonly in your garden, possibly not, depending on where specifically you're located, as these bees tend to prefer riparian or damp areas. So for example, we see a lot of them in the Haven because we're a mile from Puda Creek. You'll see lots of bumblebees along the American River Parkway, or if you're in other parts of Sacramento that have sloughs or other waterways near you, you will tend to see bumblebees in your garden. There are no solid black bumblebees in California, so a solid black bee is the carpenter bee, and these two are often confused. And despite the fact of that superficial appearance or similarity of appearance and size, they have very different lifestyles. Bumblebees are also social, unlike the carpenter bees, and they nest underground. And the bumblebee life cycle is such that only the queen passes through the winter. So she mates in the fall and then spends the winter underground. And when she emerges in the spring, it's important to have pollen sources for her that she can consume to obtain that protein that she needs to develop those eggs. So early season protein sources in the form of pollen are important for bumblebees. So that's why we recommend plants like ceanothus that bloom early or California poppies. These are great for helping bumblebees in the garden. Another common group of bees that you will see in the garden, still in the family Apidae, are the longhorn bees. While there is a longhorn bee species that we see in the spring, they're not real common, and you're much more likely to notice the longhorn bees in the summer. They seem to have a preference for plants in the sunflower family, so planting sunflowers in your garden is a great way to encourage these. And as the name suggests, they have very long antennae. That's where the name longhorn comes from. And so you will see these, as I said, very common if you do have sunflowers in your garden. In this sunflower photograph on the right, the bee at about 7 o'clock is a honeybee. About 5 o'clock is a longhorn bee, and the others are all sweat bees that we will look at in a moment. And these bees do nest underground, and so it's likely if you have sunflowers in your garden that you will not only see those male sleeping aggregations, but you may get some nesting going on in your garden as well. So moving on to a different family, the Halictidae, or the sweat bees. These are a very large, diverse group of bees. Some of them are social, some are solitary. There's underground as well as above ground nesting. They're very small bees. That Shasta daisy that you see pictured on the left, the center of that flower is about 1 inch in diameter. So that gives you an idea of how small that little sweat bee is. These are very common in gardens, and this year in particular were present in very high numbers. And it's very likely that you have these in your garden and just didn't realize what it was because it was so small. And then finally are the leafcutter bees, or Megachilidae. And Megachilidae means large lips or large mouth. Because these bees do cut leaf pieces, they need to have very strong mandibles or jaws. You may not have seen the leafcutter bee in the garden, but it's very likely that you've seen the leaf pieces that have been removed from plants. Roses and redbuds are two plants in the Sacramento area that they seem to really like. And these bees nest above ground. And so, as I mentioned before, in the wild, they would be using abandoned beetle galleries or other cracks and crevices underneath tree bark. We can create that habitat in the garden with a variety of nesting blocks. And these are really interesting to watch, and it's a really fascinating way to get a look at these bees and study their behavior. It's really, really interesting to do in the garden. So if you don't have one of these, I'd encourage you to give it a try next year. So sometimes bees can be difficult to identify in flight in the garden, but if you're able to get good pictures, there are characteristics that you may see in your photographs that weren't immediately obvious. And an example of this is with leafcutter bees. These bees have 2 submarginal cells in their wings. Submarginal refers to the cells within the wing below the margin or edge of the wing. 3 submarginal cells is much more typical, as you see with this honeybee. And then, of course, with the leafcutter bee, she's carrying pollen on the abdomen, so that's another clue as to what group that bee falls into. Another behavior that you will see with leafcutter bees, even when they don't have pollen on the abdomen, is because that is where their scopa is, where they pack the pollen, they tend to hold their abdomens erect off of the plant surface. And you can see this behavior quite nicely in the photograph on the right. And finally, another bee that you may see in the garden, especially if you have a lot of leaf cutters, is the cuckoo bee. And this particular species is a specialist or tends to prefer parasitizing or robbing the nests of leafcutter bees. There are other cuckoo bee species that have a preference for other bees, but this one is pretty common in urban gardens because leafcutters are so common. And if you're familiar with cuckoo birds, the bee works exactly the same way. It will go into a nest that's been established in which food provisions have been left. It will kill the bees that are there and lay its eggs on those food provisions. And so you'll notice looking at this bee, it doesn't have a particularly hairy body. It doesn't have any structures for pollen transport because it's not needing to collect those resources. It's stealing from other bees. And you will notice at the end of the abdomen, it has some spines that can be used in case it needs to fight with bees inside of a nest. So those are the common bees, or most common certainly, that you would see in most urban gardens in California. Obviously, as I said, we've got over 1,600 species here in the state, so this is really only a very light introduction to the amazing world of bees in our gardens. If you're interested in learning more, I'd encourage you to visit our website at beegarden.ucdavis.edu. You'll find links there to our blog as well as to social media. And in particular on our YouTube channel, we have a number of different videos that feature specific groups with a lot more detail. And then finally, I'll mention that in the comments section, or in the description rather, of this video, I have included a link to our website where you'll find a list of resources, identification guides, web pages where you can do online identification of bees, and just a lot more information if you want to learn more about how to identify bees in your gardens. So thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you next time.